Welcome back to Spellbound. I'm BJ and this video is all about those romance tropes. So I'm fascinated by the fact that common plot tropes have become now marketing tools within the past 5 years or so. But before we dive too far, let's cover the groundwork, let's cover the basics. What are tropes? Narratively speaking, or when we're referring to it in the context of a story and not in writing as figurative language, plot or character tropes are mechanisms that are somewhat universal or collective in their understanding. So in film school, we learned character tropes like the dumb blonde, the snarky best friend to the leading main character, and the rebel without a cause protagonist. But there are plot tropes too, and these are plot devices where our characters find themselves in a pretty common scenario, but one that elicits a very strong mutual tension. So plot tropes are in everything, or can be found in anything, but they're very common in romance novels. Some examples in contemporary or fantasy romance would be the one bed trope. This would be when our two main characters have to seek refuge in an inn for some amount of time, and there's only one room, and in that room there's only one bed. This obviously increases their proximity and increases their rising mutual tension. Another example in fantasy romance, or romantasy as it is sometimes referred when the main plot is a romance, is when the love interest notices that the protagonist is minimally injured and then flies into a primal protective rage. You understand? So what's interesting is that because of the rise of social media and how quickly and efficiently we're able to talk about books and communicate about books on BookTube here and on Book Talk, is that now we've started to refer to books and even categorize books based on their tropes. And we can have a conversation later on the pros and cons of this and whether you think that this is technically literary reductionism or just personally optimizing our reading preferences. Weigh in below. But what this looks like in practice is me forwarding a book to my besties and saying that this is a rivals to lovers forced proximity closed door romantasy, and them saying, great, I'll check it out, without actually knowing a single detail about the premise, plot, characters, or world. What this also looks like is that publishers and self-publishing authors are now marketing their books based off of the tropes within them. Now, for those of us who have been in on this conversation for years, this can be extremely helpful. But for those of us who are new to fantasy or romance or romantasy, or for those of us who have just recently taken the gateway drug, i.e. ACOTAR, and are now horny little romance goblins, this can probably be a little overwhelming at first. So I've put together a silly little guide to help us categorize and then discuss some of the most popular romance tropes. Relationship tropes. These are the tropes that specifically describe the romance between characters and the arc that their relationship takes within the story. 3 of the most common relationship tropes are enemies to lovers, rivals to lovers, and friends to lovers. Enemies to lovers. This is when two characters are opposed to each other in the beginning, probably prejudiced toward each other or predetermined to distrust or not like each other based off of various plot or world-building reasons, and then throughout the course of the book they learn each other's perspective and then grow in their affection. For example, in contemporary romance, The Hating Game by Sally Thorne was marketed as an enemies to lovers workplace or office romance because the two characters were on opposing ends of a merger of a publishing house, and so they each represented two completely different philosophies when it came to publishing literature as consumer products. On top of that, they each represented two opposing stereotypes, where he was the type A, buttoned up, hyper-organized, monochrome, professional that likes to make everyone around him afraid of him, and she was the sort of petite, spastic, chaotic, colorful, free spirit with a collection of oddities. This is probably the most common relationship trope in fantasy romance, and that's because you can really mine the whole opposites attract thing for more than just character stereotypes and value differences. For example, in Serpent and Dove by Shelby Mahurin, you have Lou and Reed. So in a world largely inspired by medieval Paris, you have witches like Lou and chasers or witch hunters like Reed. So the chasers are militaristic in their form and function, but they're also part of the church, like a church militia. So they're naturally very pious too. So consider how the fantasy elements of this world help create opportunities to have a richer and deeper chasm between our two main characters. So not only are they in opposition in personality, with him being a very stoic, by-the-book, overachieving, pious military man, and her being a magic-wielding gutter snipe on the run, very crass and improper, but he's a chaser by occupation. So he has grown up this way, it's his lifestyle, it's his value system, it very much shapes his reality. And her being a witch, that's literally her blood. It's who she is. It's her family. It's her destiny. It's her purpose. So you can see that you have a lot of ground that you have to shift and change in order to see each other's perspective. And that's why this one is so common in fantasy romance, and that's why the tension is usually so high. And one more thing I want to touch on with regard to an enemies to lovers setup is its inherent lack of misogyny. By nature of considering someone an enemy, you have to consider them an equal. You can't think of someone beneath you and also as an enemy. So there's an implied respect in the foundation of the relationship. Even if it's also coupled with loathing and hatred, sure, that only adds to the tension. But the respect is there from the beginning, and that is the foundation for which attraction can grow from there. And that's actually not the pattern of other relationship plots in contemporary romance novels or in the lived experience of women within a misogynistic and patriarchal system. In a heterosexual relationship, in a patriarchal society, a man has to see a woman as attractive before they decide to treat them with respect, because a woman who's not attractive isn't worth respect at all. So the implied respect that is given from a man to a woman is considered a gift and part of that attraction and part of the romance story. So in an enemies to lovers premise, none of that exists, because the respect and considering someone an enemy is literally part of the foundation of their meet cute. And this is a tangent that I could seriously keep going on for several more minutes, but I do think that Mel over at Page Melt on TikTok can add a lot more nuance to that conversation. So I do think you should check out their videos if you can. Rivals to lovers. We're seeing a bit more of this trope lately, and it is similar in nature to the enemies to lovers trope in that our two main characters are not each other's biggest fans, but it's much less of an opposites attract situation happening. And that's because our two main characters are aligned in some way, they're on the same side or the same team in something. They're aligned in some way because they both ultimately want the same thing. They just both believe that they should be the one to have it. So here, the tension comes from a sense of competition and loathing as opposed to values-based opposition and repulsion. An example of this in contemporary romance would be Book Lovers by Emily Henry. So here, our two main characters are a literary agent and a book editor. So they both ultimately want the same things, the books that they represent to be great. So they're not exactly enemies, but they both also believe that their way of viewing things and their way of doing things and working with literature is the correct way. A fantasy romance example would be The Night Circus by Emily Morgenstern. So here our protagonist and our love interest are two magicians, and they're trapped in this centuries-long feud at the behest of their mentors. So they've both been conditioned over a very long period of time to distrust each other, and ultimately though, they're still in this context just rivals competing in this endless duel, and that is the source of their romantic tension. But also my bestie Caitlin would truly be upset if I did not also include the pastoral Canadian classic Anne of Green Gables in this conversation, as Anne and Gilbert did honestly set the standard for rivals to lovers. And then we've got friends to lovers, and personally this is my least favorite. I cannot with a friends to lovers setup, but I know that that's truly a matter of personal preference because this is a wildly popular relationship trope. Often, this trope spans a long period of time, as opposed to other romances which can last beginning to end over a matter of days or a couple of months. And that's because A friends to lovers setup usually requires to communicate the consistency of a friendship over a long period of time in order to establish the foundation that you're building from. That's why a lot of friends to lovers setups end up being childhood friends to lovers, like in Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo, which is fantasy romance. But you could also have long-standing adult friendships, like in People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry, which is contemporary romance. One that I think does have a good balance of not having to be a 10-year friendship, but still showing the progression of time is Hook, Line, and Sinker by Tessa Bailey. Plot tropes. Tropes can also be used to describe the type of plots you might encounter in a romance novel. And these can be anything from arranged marriage to fake dating, forced proximity, office romances, and even a bully romance. And these are also not mutually exclusive. So you could have a romance novel that has a number of these plot tropes. Fake dating. This is when our two characters are forced by circumstance to pretend to date each other, usually to the benefit of one or both partners. Naturally, during their fake courtship, they start to see each other in a new light and grow in their attraction and romance. Often this trope will include a character who's like chronically independent, sort of like, I don't need anyone, and then there will be a scene in which the love interest defends the main character in public or stands up for them in such a way that A, the defense of the main character was the love interest's natural reaction anyway because they already valued the main character, and B, it shows the main character and kind of lets them experience what it's like to be defended, but also to kind of be truly seen after a pattern of feeling misunderstood. So if those are vibes that you like, then those are often present in a fake dating plot trope setup. And a good example of this trope is Take a Hint, Dani Brown by Talia Hibbert. Arranged marriage. Yes, this is still a pretty popular trope in the year of your Lord 2023. Pretty wild, right? But here is where we actually see this trope. In contemporary romance, it's most often an arranged or fake engagement, which usually defaults to the fake dating trope. And this can be seen in the recent release Unfortunately Yours by Tessa Bailey. But we see this more in historical romances or Regency romances, those classic bodice rippers. So one example here would be When a Scot Ties the Knot by Tessa Dare, that does have an arranged marriage trope that it follows pretty formulaically. So I personally don't read a ton of historical romances, but I do really enjoy watching Emily Heath at Emily Heath Bar Books on TikTok, and she has really great recommendations based on plots, tropes, and vibes. But we also see this in dark romance, specifically in mafia romances. So Rena Kent is a dark mafia romance writer who employs the arranged marriage trope quite a lot. Forced proximity. So my husband made the Our Tropes graphic that was going around on Instagram, on Bookstagram, several weeks ago, and he was like, what is forced proximity? Because I don't think I like the sound of it. So I had to explain to him that it's not a bad thing, and it's not like a kink or anything. It just means that the two characters are kind of forced to spend a lot of time together and get to know each other very quickly based off of various circumstances. In fantasy, you'll see this if two unlikely characters have to like team up and go on a quest together, like in Sweet and Bitter Magic by Adrienne Tooley. In contemporary, you'll see this if two characters have to work on a project together, like in Astrid Parker Doesn't Fail, when they have to team up to work on an HGTV inspired like fixer-up show. Basically, any situation where our two main characters are forced to spend time together where they otherwise wouldn't is considered forced proximity. So even in Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, when these two political figures, adult children, have to sort of spend time together to prove to the world that they don't hate each other and therefore their countries are perfectly stable, that would also be considered a forced proximity. In our case, we were working on a very demanding project and we were the only two writers. And for half of it, we were working like 10 to 12 hour days together. And you get to know someone when you work together that closely for like 9 months straight. Bully romance. Possibly the most debated or controversial from this list, and not unjustly, is the bully romance. Naturally, this plotline escalates the intensity that you could get from a different plotline with a slower burn intimacy scale. So some do call this plotline lazy. However, others argue that this type of plot trope offers more of a growth on behalf of both characters. So one character learning to kind of speak up and stand up for themselves, and another one learning that people deserve respect. However, going back to what we talked about with regard to respect earlier, this book does play into the typical pattern of male attraction within a patriarchal society in which the love interest doesn't learn to treat the main character with respect until they find them attractive. So in this way, this plot trope is one of the more misogynistic from the outset, or at least it leans on misogynistic principles in order to operate and can subvert them if done so intentionally. One thing about this trope that I do like is that sometimes it can morph into a revenge story arc, and I'm personally willing to make that trade every time. A bully romance plot trope for a revenge story arc? Yes, every time. Personally, most of these plot lines make me really annoyed and frustrated, what with all the misogyny, but one author that I think does this trope justice with regard to extremely feminist protagonists and undertones and overtones is C.M. Stunich. She has a Burberry prep quartet in which these dudes at a prep school are really horrible to our protagonist because she's like poor or something stupid. So she takes her time and hatches like a really intricate revenge plot. And Stunich takes her time with this like revenge story to develop, with the entire setup happening in book 1 and the revenge happening in books 2, 3, and 4. Tension tropes. But those aren't even all the tropes. There are also tropes that describe the romantic tension and the sexual tension in modern romances. Slow burn versus insta-love. The romantic tension refers to the romantic progression of the character's mutual interest. A slow burn is one that takes most of the plot to develop. So like Mary Pearson's The Revenant Chronicles that starts with the kiss of deception, that is a slow burn romance. An insta-love romance is exactly what it sounds like. So there's very little tension or conflict between the characters up front, and they actually get together pretty quickly. And then the plot is dedicated to them solving conflict as a unit, as opposed to the entire plot being them working to get together. An example of this might be I'm in Love with Mothman by Paige Lavoie. Spicy versus closed door. This sexual tension relates obviously to the sexual chemistry and the attraction that exists between two characters. Just like this exists on a spectrum with people, books reflect that as well. So despite its reputation, not all romance novels have sex in them or even implied sex. A book that does not show on the page sexual intimacy is called Closed Door, or sometimes Fade to Black. And that's when sex is either not at all part of the story, or whether it's implied but not directly shown or referenced. The UNHONEYMOONERS by Christina Lauren and The 12 Dates of Christmas by Jenny Bayliss are considered closed-door romances. On the other hand, if sexual intimacy is on the page, then it's considered spicy, and when it's discussed on social media, it's often referred to with the pepper emoji to determine how spicy or sexually explicit. Talia Hibbert's The Brown Sisters books are considered medium spice, Anna Huang's Twisted Love series are considered very spicy, and Katie Roberts' series are considered extremely spicy with the presence of kink. And while we're mentioning the Twisted Love series, that's like an entire series of tropes. There's seriously one of everything in this entire series. You have enemies to lovers, friends to lovers, brother's best friend, gag, bodyguard trope. There's literally something in here for everyone. So there is nothing wrong with closed-door romance, just like there's nothing wrong with spicy romance. But if you are looking for a romance, whether that's contemporary fantasy or other, that doesn't have any spice to it, just call it closed door. Don't call it clean, because that implies that sex is dirty somehow, which it isn't, and that's some serious purity culture fundy shit, and we don't have time for that. Sex is a perfectly normal, perfectly natural, perfectly clean part of life, and as long as it is safe and consensual, it should be celebrated to everyone's preference, and that includes in books. So that's what we've got for today, some of the most popular romance tropes out there, but I know that I did not include all of the tropes by far. So let me know below, what are your favorite tropes and which ones did I not include that I should have, and maybe we can make a part 2. And then if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you loved it, hit subscribe, and of course there's always Instagram. Take care, stay spicy, and happy reading.